Hi, welcome to Gallery Talk at Rio Hondo College. I'm Robert Miller, your host today, and I'm here with Ada Polini Brown, who's our artist, and we're here at her show Through the Imperium. The show runs at Rio Hondo College April 7th through May 17, 2022. Welcome, Ada.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
A little bit about Ada's biography before we start. Ada, you were born originally a New Yorker, so you're transplanted.
Yes.
Ada earned her MFA from the University of Houston and a BFA in studio art from Queens College in New York. You attended Sarah Lawrence. You worked in France, I believe.
I taught all through Europe and France for a travel program that I created called Art Travel. And I did that for like 20 years.
That's
taking
amazing.
artists to Europe to study landscape painting with me.
You were an artist resident in Vermont at the Vermont Studio Center.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And worked at Bob Blackburn's printmaking studio in New York. So, and a big part of the early days of one of my favorite self-help graphics.
I did printmaking at Self-Help when I first came to Los Angeles.
So how did you come to let's start there with how did you get here from? What made you move from New York to LA?
I was so happy in New York. I had a loft and I was working 2 days a week at a job and painting. And my husband, though, was a cinematographer, and he started working in Los Angeles. And then I was hired to do a job to teach in Italy. So he went to Los Angeles to work, and then he was in Asia shooting, and I was in Italy teaching painting. So at some point, we had to find a place that we could live near each other because this was not going to be working. We were going in two different directions. And at the time, he was making more money than I was. So we came to Los Angeles and loaded up a 25-foot truck with paintings and art supplies and everything else and 3 cats and drove cross country. And so we came to Los Angeles. I didn't think I would really like it as much as I did because I'm a native New Yorker and I was a dyed-in-the-wool. In my world, it was New York and then nothing there, and then there was California, so at least we were going there, but nothing in between. So the drive across country was interesting, and going to California changed a lot for me, and I really ended up loving living here. So
Big change in the art scene. Well, let's start kind of a little before that. Now, let's maybe talk a little bit about how you became an artist, and was it something you discovered in school, or any family members that were artists that influenced you?
Well, I did grow up in my family were Italian immigrants. My grandfather was an opera singer and a professor of language. My grandmother was a pianist, so they were in the arts on my father's side. But his cousin was Pio Pullini, not Pio, I'm sorry. Yeah, Pio Pullini, who was a painter and illustrator in Europe and has now gotten some acclaim for his work because he actually stayed there when the Nazis were occupying Italy, and he did a series of drawings and paintings that were never shown until recently, where he was making fun of the Nazi occupation. So he was an artist, and I saw his work. I saw some drawings that he did. My father always was very cultured and brought that into our lives. So my love of opera comes from that. And so I did have some art in our family. It was respected, so it wasn't a problem when I decided I was going to be an artist. Maybe because I was a daughter also. So I had that in my family, and I loved it. And I was fortunate enough to be in New York City, which had a very good public school system at the time. And I was introduced to being an art major in junior high school. And we had extra classes in art and drawing because I was always doing that anyway. I just loved drawing. And finally, a teacher of mine said, you should apply for the high school here. There was music and art and design. There were lots of those specialty schools in New York. They're still there. And I applied and got into the High School of Art and Design. And that really, our teachers were all professionals. Most of them were working in the art business, commercial art, film, and they were just exciting and interesting. It was a really great experience because I had to also take the subway and a bus to Manhattan every day to go to school because I was growing up in Queens. And it was like crossing that bridge. The whole world turned from black and white Queens, where I was growing up, to full color. And it was so exciting to be in New York in the mid-'60s, and we'd sneak out of school and go to the Museum of Modern Art or the Metropolitan Museum of Art and see art, or down to the Village to listen to music. So it was always an exciting world. And at that point in time, I just knew I was going to be an artist. But when I was very young, a person said to me, I was maybe like 12, and I was drawing, and she said, "Oh, you're an artist." I didn't even think it was a thing. So it took a little bit of time before it clicked. Like, I guess I am an artist. And so I've always loved making art, and I've always known that's what I wanted to do. Even though I was good at a lot of other things, art was the most intriguing and also the most difficult and challenging thing I could do. So I found that I just wanted to do that.
That's wonderful. I mean, that's so exciting, and it's so wonderful as both of us. I mean, we know each other because we were educators together. How school has impacted and gave you that, as well as your family, that opportunity. So now you came over with the truck and the cats, and you're in LA, and you decided to share your sort of skills and talent with students. Let's talk a little bit about, I know you just retired a couple years ago, 20 years at Rio Hondo College.
Just about 20, 15 or 16 full-time. And that was the opportunity that California offered to me. I did, when I left graduate school in Houston, when I graduated, I was teaching there and came back to New York, and I looked for jobs, and I did have a few, part-time jobs. I taught at Sing Sing Prison. I taught painting and I taught art history, and then came to California with that credential and stuff that I was doing as a teacher, and I knew I liked teaching. That was very natural for me to do, and I love sharing what I love. And it was a way to learn more about what I love and get better at it at the same time as I share it. Because as you know, when you teach, you're the one you're teaching yourself far more than your students ever get. You're going beyond that and yourself. So it was a really exciting thing to do. And coming to Rio Hondo and California, which at that point in time had a very strong equal opportunity policy. And that, because I applied for jobs where I know that the person was already selected, but I was part of a group of people that were interviewed for the purpose of making it look like they had enough of a group that was women and people of color, but they already had the person they were hiring. And that happened enough times, but here in California at Rio Hondo, it was amazing. They were just like, "Come on in, we want to interview you." I did the interview, and I was shocked that I got the job, because I thought it would be like every other job. "Oh, we'll offer you a part-time job." So I found my home here, and I loved the school. I love the students. I still have it in my heart, because this is a very important place to have come to work. And so I had a career that really worked well. Teaching in Europe happened when I was in New York at first. I taught for Art Workshops International, and then I came to LA, and I met up with a school on the west side, the Brentwood Arts Center. And when I got to talking with them, they knew that I was teaching in Europe, and they said, "We've always wanted to do a travel program." So we went into business together, and I created a travel program for them. And then it was when they sold the school, I was on my own. And it fulfilled a dream I had since I was at Sarah Lawrence College as a child, as a teenager or whatever. I was in first semester of college or something. I went to a summer program in France, and I found myself on a mountaintop with goats going by and landscape, and I'm in there painting a landscape. And I just had this epiphany at that point saying, if I could spend my life traveling and making art, I think I would be happy. And I ultimately did that. And coming to California helped, because I also had a way to make a living that was still art and share that with people that I enjoy, my students. And so, yeah, I feel very blessed and very lucky. I've had it really good.
That's great. Before we go into your show, there's one more kind of area I want to talk about. And one of the most exciting things, and I've been talking about this a lot, because we are still in sort of the pandemic, even though we're coming out on the better side of it. One of the things I love since you retired 2 years ago, and one of the reasons I really was excited about having you here for this show was, and I was just with a group last night of artists and talking about the same issue where a lot of them, how even though the pandemic should have been one of the greatest times for so many of us, myself as an artist, making work, how so many artists got shut down, had lost their inspiration, couldn't make work. I know you have had a studio at the brewery forever and have a home studio. You were so prolific. You made a whole new body of work. So can you talk about a little bit about your studio practice and how your pandemic experience was in making art during the last 2 years since you retired?
My art has always been the way I process the world around me. It's always been, for me, in my head, this very busy place full of so much information, and I'm confused by all of it, and I have to think about it, and I have to process it all. And making art is a way for me to focus and understand the world that I live in. I've done that since I was a kid. And so when the pandemic hit, it was a scary time for everybody, including me. And so I think about the things that we did that first beginning of the pandemic, and I was fortunate enough to be able to get food delivered, but then we washed everything off and all of that crazy stuff we did before we brought it into the house and had wipes and all that stuff. So it was a really scary time, but at the same time, I wasn't able to get to the brewery studio, which is outside my house, because I had someone who was sharing the space, so I just left that person there, and I stayed at my home studio, which I was working in. And to have the opportunity to process what was going on in the world in my studio was a godsend. I mean, it just made me think clearly, okay, calm down. Don't watch any more news and just do what you're supposed to do. Wear your mask when you go out and stay home till the epidemic goes away. And so I was really lost in that space, and I was happy to work. I did a couple of projects that I got involved in, which were helpful. There was a shoebox projects that did a thing called call and response. I did 2 of those, where they just randomly select artists and we bounce off each other. I make a piece a day, send it to them by email, email an image of it, and then the next person sends a response to it. So I did 2 of those projects. I did another project called Telephone that a group of artists from San Francisco brought artists from all around the world, where we responded like a telephone game. So I got a poem and a photograph from 2 people, and then I had to make a work of art and pass it on. And then it just went viral. There were so many people. So those things kind of kept me rolling while I was here making work.
Now, one thing, knowing you for a while, you've always had this wonderful group that comes to your house for life drawing. And, you know, you're one of the few artists that I know, it's not, how do I say this nicely? Like, I'm an artist, I know what I'm doing. You're still always working on your, we'll call it craft, your skills, you have life drawing groups, you have friends, and a sort of a community. Mm-hmm. Did you continue that?
No, we had to shut down during the pandemic. During the height of the pandemic, I had to close down, and the poor models, I mean, I paid them anyway, but we stopped for months until after we could start getting our vaccines, and then it was safe enough to come back and work. So it was a year and a half, I think, that we stopped, and I missed it terribly. And a drawing group is something that, because I am basically someone who is a realist artist, I don't make abstract work, but I'm making work based on what I see. So observation is important. Drawing the figure is, for me, part of that practice of keeping my observational skills going. It's the hardest thing to do. It's really, as I used to tell my students in life drawing, you can draw a tree and no one's going to know if that limb is bigger than this limb. But if you do it with the figure and you don't abstract it well enough, like a Picasso, you look like you don't know what you're doing. So that is a real challenge, and I love doing it. And so I've had a group now, God, it's got to be almost 20 years, that we've worked at my studio at the brewery, and then we worked in my house and in my home studio now. And we're back. So we finally got everybody's vaccinated. It's a small group of 6. They're all professional artists, some retired teachers like myself and making art, and our models are vaccinated. I've actually had to not hire models back who refused to get vaccinated. It's like, I'm sorry, I can't bring you in. So we're back to drawing, and it's every Wednesday.
It's wonderful that it's back. I mean, I think that is such a healthy thing for all artists to do. But I sort of got to tell the story of this show, and I want to sort of bring it into the show, which is so exciting. One of the things I found like incredible is for people who are new to how a show works and how galleries work, and we're a university gallery, a college gallery. Shows are booked usually a year to 2 in advance, and when we talk about work and how work changes. So when I asked Ada, when I asked you to come up and bring your work, you brought the U-Haul, and we had talked about different bodies of work, and you have some really incredible bodies of work that I've watched develop over the last couple of years. One that I've always loved is your Migrant series, and those images are just so strong and powerful and beautiful. Then you had which relate really well, we could talk about in a second how they relate, the Veiled series, women of different nationalities wearing veils and how they influence, different cultures and that. And then I was surprised with what we have here. And I was totally blown away during that pandemic that you created a whole new body of work. And so all this work showed up, and when we started to go through it, I realized, wait, there's something really exciting and really new with this Cloud series. And that was so brand new, and most people hadn't seen it. And I was so excited and realized you had done so much work that I'm like, this is a whole show. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about the transition and how the work has changed, and they do have this interesting relationship from one to the other.
Well, as I said, my head gets very busy with how I react with the world. The Veiled Women came about from a encounter at an airport when we still could travel, where I was wearing a sleeveless tank top, and I'm standing in line at Orly Airport, and suddenly this person pinches me. I turn around, it's a woman completely dressed. Now, this was before 9/11, and she was completely veiled. And she looked at me, and she's scolding me for looking like that. Why am I dressed like that? And I look at her, and it must have been 100 degrees in the airport. And I'm like, it is so hot. Why are you dressed like that? So that reaction, I could see she was smiling at me. And we're probably around the same age. And I was smiling at her and laughing. And we laughed at each other, and it made me think about, okay, I guess she's happy dressing like that, and I'm happy dressing like this. But I also remember being veiled. I grew up Roman Catholic, and we had to wear a veil on our head to go to church. I wore a veil for my Holy Communion. I was supposed to wear a veil for my marriage, but my poor mother wasn't around to deal with that with me at some level. Thank you. I'm sorry, but I didn't have to do that. I didn't do it. It was a rebellion of my own. So that my upbringing, and then I was taught by nuns as well. So the veiling process, why are people veiling? And so I started researching, looking at veiling and how women and veils function in the world, around the world. And of course, after 9/11, that became a very hot issue. And the Taliban, here we are back again where they have to cover themselves. So it hasn't ended, it's not ending. So that made me, that part was still who I am. And in a way, I was scrambling with what in my head was going on with who I am and how I was raised, and then what the rest of the world is about. The Migrant series is about what's happening around the world. I'm reacting again to this world that we live in, and there are people migrating, and humans have always migrated across the world. They've moved, but we have borders and countries now, so it's even more difficult. And people are moving mainly now because of hunger, starvation, and climate and war. So this is migration that we're creating, but yet we're holding people back, or we're letting some in. I mean, there's a huge difference between the migration now that's happening because of the war in Ukraine than the migration that is attempting to happen because people coming from Haiti. And they're both there because of horrible events. So what is that about? So I just had to say most of these people are women and children. And it means a lot to me to see how women and children live. So I painted a series about migrants. And I was discovering in that series, more so than the Veiled series, the format of the square and building a frame around it, putting gold, putting texture on the work, some layering of colors. So I was looking at surface and texture as well as the figurative drawing of those figures. So I paint from what I see, but I'm also painting from what I'm learning and what I see and understand the world to be. COVID set the world in a very different place because I was home a lot in my backyard with the dog and the cats, and then walking to my studio. And the world that I saw was a very limited place at that time. From my backyard, I have a sky view, and I have a telephone pole that was lit up and beautiful with a bird sitting on it. So one day I decided I was going to paint the telephone pole in the sky because the clouds were gorgeous. Why were the clouds gorgeous? We were having stormy weather. We were having major fires. And pollution is always in part of LA too. So I was drawing and painting the sky. And the one with the telephone pole, I just decided I didn't need the pole. The sky is what really interested me. And I was a landscape painter when I taught landscape painting in Europe, and I did a lot of landscape. That meant a lot to me. The challenge of a landscape painting, the sky was always the most difficult for me. So again, it was like, I can do the sky. I've got to work on how to do the sky. So I started researching clouds. I started taking photos when I walked the dog of the sky, sat in the backyard, drew the sky, got up early in the morning, photographed the sky. And so the sky became something, but I didn't want to just do a painting of a sky. I didn't want the phone, the telephone pole. I didn't want a landscape at the bottom. I just wanted the sky. And then the shapes, it hit me. And the shapes first came about almost accidentally as an idea, like, what if I threw a square on top of it? Paint that. What if I do this? So I kind of was looking at different shapes and things to put into the sky. And then they took on a stronger meaning for me.
Well, we've talked about that, and at least when I talk to students and gallery visitors hear about the show and get their opinion, to our students, that strong circle, square, triangle has a certain meaning, which has been fun, the controller's on a video game for them, say.
Right.
So okay, there's their plug. But I'll ask, where does that come from? And when I saw these, that's kind of one, there definitely is an ethereal kind of quality to your painting. They have sort of that dusk, dawn kind of, gorgeous illumination. And then it really was exciting knowing the order they were painted in, where, like, if we look at Full Circle, which is number 3 in the gallery, the circle is very prominent. And obviously the circle and the triangle especially, these are things, circles, the halo, the triangle, the 3 points. There's a strong religious content. And that was one of the first questions I asked you, knowing you have a sort of religious background. Were you aware of sort of the religious connotations behind?
Well, I think when I thought of the circle, the square, and then I haven't really done many triangles except for that house, which was being home. But the circle and the square, these are the primary Platonic forms. They're just simple geometric forms. Some of the earliest, and I loved geometry as a kid. It was my favorite math class. But those simple forms, for me, were, perhaps there is a spiritual part to it, because when I look at the work now, I can see that these were almost like prayers in some ways. So I see them as quiet. There's some kind of stillness to this work, which perhaps was the opposite of what was going on in the world, because we were worried about COVID, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, all of this stuff that was happening out in the world, and I was home looking at the sky. So I think that stillness that I wanted is there in the painting, and it was I guess it has a religious connotation. For some might see it as that, because you're not the first person who said that to me. And you said they're like meditations and they're like prayers. Well, one of the things I did do a lot more of while I was home was yoga. So I don't know.
There's that. But I also found, because I know I squeezed you a little bit to get the last one, the first two that are in line in the gallery, the Golden Line and Night. I think it was Night that you were still putting the final layer of. You like, I'm almost done with it. I'm like, I have to have it for the show.
Right.
Like, I hate to say this, like, paint faster. It's like back to my old gallery days where, like, client's waiting for it, paint faster. The show opens, like, it's done. But they're a little more moody. But what's interesting is sort of the circle and the square, or the circles have faded. But the power of the line is so amazing and prominent. And you chose to use gold, and on one you use gold leaf, which then the whole religious history of gold leaf once again, and the Golden Line is the first one that has the gold leaf. A lot of people, it's hard to see it on camera, but it's such a stunning painting, and the gold leaf then has that connotation again, but it's not used in the same way. But having the line that has gold leaf sort of, for me, kicked that in a very subtle, kind of interesting way. Were you aware of that? Was it just a...
Well, I was trying, I was keeping the geometric form not contained as in the center of the painting, the way the circles of the square were. And there was just something traveling by. And the use of gold leaf I used in the veiled women paintings. They were always, many of them, behind gold or a pattern. And I took a trip to Turkey, and I loved Istanbul and what I saw there. So that gold leaf and gold and mosaic was part of how I think. And there is, again, those have a sense of being more a sense of awe at what the sky is. And so that golden line. And it's funny, because when you're talking about that line, I remember seeing in many churches in Europe, there's a line that leads right through, and it's supposed to go to it's the meridian. It's supposed to lead you to where and in certain times of the day in some of the churches, that gold line lights up to tell you you're right at the equinox, at that solstice or summer or winter. And so it just turns, and so that's there. It's always going to be. I don't think I can get away from that upbringing that I have. It's just very Eurocentric. Been to Europe many times, love churches, love art history. For me as a child, the part that I loved about church was the music, the stained glass window, the art on the wall. When they started speaking English, I was out. But the Latin was great because I had no idea what they were saying. So it was just, that's still who I am, I guess, on some level.
Were there any other major influences? I know for me, I always go back to the church. We have politics, which was a big thing. Any major artists that influenced how you work, or major events? I've taught art history, and I loved art history in school. I was like in Queens College, I was like art history and studio art major. And I go through periods and have gone through periods of loving certain artists. I loved Giotto, which is the proto-Renaissance, pre-Renaissance artist who decorated churches all over Europe, was considered one of the great artists of his time. And Giotto's work is very geometric. And Giotto is just the beginning of that understanding of the Renaissance, and the idea of form and solidity in the figure starts to come about through Giotto, and the use of perspective. And then, of course, he's always very simple geometry. So that's part of why I love Giotto, and also a fabulous colorist. Then I've gone through periods where I love Cézanne. That's the landscape painting. And Cézanne I love because he's a very intellectual, observational painter. He doesn't just paint what he sees, but he paints what he sees and reacts to
that mark making onto the surface in a very special way that I find exciting about painting. And it's a little bit like the drawing, where you have to respond to what you see and you have to react and put it on the work. And that, to me, was another influence that I just love, that kind of work, that observational work. There's so many artists that I love. In a contemporary painting and work, I think when I look at some of these, I see, especially with the use of the line, I see more contemporary artists, but I think I basically go back to art history more when I look at art, you know? There's a lot of artists that I love. That's one of the hard parts. I can't just say, oh, Matisse. Well, during a period of time in my life, Matisse was the most important artist in the world to me, and then it was another artist. And so I move around a lot, and it might even be whose biography I'm reading at the time. I don't know.
That's a great thing. Well, we are running out of time, but I do want to announce that Rio Hondo has published your catalog. So your catalog, we do have some copies of that.
Great.
You have some copies of that. And please, to see more of Ada's work, we'll be posting your website information, and that lists upcoming shows. You're a great showing artist, so they could go online and see that. And for contact, we'll be listing your email. And I'd like to thank my dean for making this happen. We have amazing staff, Wendy and Abby, and of course Teresa Dreyfus, our president of the university, who supported this program. So we'd like to thank them, and most important, thank you for bringing your amazing work to the gallery, and thank you for your time today, Ada. It's really special.
I do want to say thank you to everyone that you just mentioned, of course, because the effort and the amount of work you guys do, especially while we're still in this pandemic and just starting to get back to life mode, has been heroic. And thank you, everyone at Rio Hondo, Grant, Robert. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.